Inequality rates have been exploding over the past few decades. The world's richest 26 people have enough wealth as the bottom 50% of the world. 4.3 billion people are living below the poverty line. That's over 50% of the global population. And we have enough food to feed 10 billion people, yet billions go hungry every single day. Even in rich countries, the poverty rate is absolutely appalling. In the US, 1 in 3 children are poor and 40 million people live below the poverty line. The mainstream narrative is that this divide between rich and poor countries has always existed. We are always taught that this level of poverty and inequality is just a natural phenomenon. We are always taught in schools that North America and Europe were able to develop much faster because they had better technology, better institutions, a better work ethic, and they worked so much harder than the global south. And we're taught that the global south was simply corrupt and they were too lazy and they didn't have the institutions or technology or work ethic or values to develop as fast as the global north. And this mainstream narrative has gained so much support and acceptance because it supports our current economic system, it supports the power structures that are currently in place, and it prevents us from challenging the status quo. But as soon as we bring history back into the picture, this theory starts to fall apart. The divide between rich and poor countries isn't natural or inevitable, it has been created. In the year 1500, there was no significant difference between the living standards between Europe and the rest of the world. So why has there been such a mass accumulation of wealth on one side of the globe and not the other? And how has this pattern of growth and decline been maintained for the last 500 years? And why is inequality getting so much worse year upon year? And why is this nothing that we're ever taught about in schools? In this video, I'm going to be tracing the history of colonization and how that led to the great global divide between the rich and poor countries that we have today, and how Western-backed coups maintain the continuation of new forms of colonization, and how inequality and poverty lie at the very core of the logic of capitalism. And in the next video, which I'm going to upload next week, I'm going to talk about how these systems of inequality and poverty are maintained in the 21st century through global multinational institutions. In schools, we're always taught that Britain's technological innovations jump-started the Industrial Revolution that spread throughout Europe and the United States. And through this, Britain built profitable industries and manufacturing goods which helped skyrocket their living standards to unprecedented new levels. But although this is partially true, if we rewind to the 1500s, a very different story emerges. Around this time, there was very little difference between the living standards between Europeans and the rest of the world. In fact, a lot of historians actually argue that in South America, Asia, and India, people were actually better off than Europeans. But this all changed when Christopher Columbus travelled with 17 fleets and 1,200 men around the Caribbean, capturing thousands of indigenous Americans to be sent back and sold to Europe as slaves. He was followed by many other colonial conquerors who went on mass vicious colonial expeditions throughout Latin America, where they murdered and enslaved millions, forcing indigenous inhabitants to work to bring conquerors multitudes of natural resources like gold and silver, and forced them to work on cotton and sugar plantations, killing or maiming the ones who wouldn't conform or do the work as quickly as they were told. By the early 1800s, a total of 100 million kilograms of silver had been taken from Latin America and pumped into the European economy. And by the mid-1600s, the Latin American population had been slashed to just 3.5 million people, which means that 95% of their population had been killed. Because the Latin American industries were only allowed to produce a handful of agricultural goods, they were prevented from developing their own domestic industries. This meant they became dependent on Europe for the manufactured goods they needed, and as I'll go into in the next video, this meant that they would be locked in a state of economic dependence on Europe, which continues till today. The slave trade in Africa had also begun in the early 1500s. By the end of the slave trade in 1853, somewhere between 12 million and 15 million Africans had been shipped across the Atlantic. Without the resources and labour extracted from the slave colonies in Africa and Latin America, Europe would not have been able to shift its economic capacity towards industrialisation. Imagine what the world would look like today if the sum of the value produced by African slaves, worth hundreds of trillions of dollars, was taken from the Western economy and added to the wealth of Africa. Economists often argue that the global south is underdeveloped because they naturally lack capital, but this isn't the case at all. Any type of alternative modes of organizing society were completely destroyed by the Europeans, and the Europeans used their labor power and their resources to develop Europe. The global south could technically have developed just as Europe did, were it not for the continuous labor and resource extraction, and were it not for the fact that it was kept in a relationship of economic dependence with Europe. But this isn't the full picture of how Europeans managed to industrialize. Historians tell us that there were many states that accumulated vast amounts of wealth but didn't become capitalists at this time. In order for capitalism to work, it needed workers. When we think of medieval peasants, we usually assume that they lived miserable lives. With disease, low nutritional standards and low life expectancy, in many ways it was miserable. But peasants did have the most important thing they needed to guarantee a stable livelihood. They had secure access to land for food, water, cooking and shelter. The right to these things was protected by long-standing traditions and laws. Throughout the Middle Ages, most people in Europe wouldn't have wanted to work for wages. People didn't need to earn wages in order to work. Historians tell us that at this time it was unthinkable for anyone to not have secure access to the basic resources needed for survival. But in the 15th century, all of this changed. Wealthy nobles, starting in England and expanding throughout Europe, were eager to profit off of the labour of the peasantry in order to continue the industrialisation mission. They dissolved old feudal obligations and abolished the right of habitation that had protected peasants for so many centuries. In one of the most violent transformations in human history, the enclosure movement, as it came to be known, saw the privatization of tens of millions of acres over the course of 2 or 3 centuries, and the clearance of hundreds of villages, as 70% of peasants were thrown off their land. By the middle of the 19th century, it was complete. There was almost no land left, and millions of people had been forcibly displaced from their homes. Historians have documented that for the peasantry, wage labour was nothing more than slavery. Experience demonstrates that there may be a slavery of wages, only a little less galling and crushing in its effects than chattel slavery, warned former slave Frederick Douglass, and this slavery of wages must go down with the other. Whilst they weren't technically slaves, they had no choice but to work. Because they no longer had the right to land, the landowners gave leases only to those who were able to produce the most. Those who were less productive would be kicked off the land and left with no homes, no land, no food. The only way to survive was to sell their labour for wages in terrible conditions, regularly working 16-hour days for very little wages, whilst the owners became wealthy. The competitive nature of the labour market meant that their productivity increased at much higher rates than their wages. This created a conveyor belt for the redistribution of wealth upwards and created vast levels of inequality between the rich and the poor. The landless working class also became the first consumer society because they needed commodities for even the most basic things such as food and clothes and housing. This marked the formal birth of capitalism. For the first time in history, people's lives were governed by the need to maximize productivity and maximize profit. In other words, the products that were created by the workers were sold for more than the value of their work. So a worker may have been paid £2 for making cloth, but the capitalist sold the cloth for £5. In this way, the capitalist who controls the process of production makes a profit, but the worker does not benefit from this added value and fails to benefit from the fruits of his or her own labour, and this is a form of exploitation. And people were left to find their own food, shelter, clothing and water, which has proven extremely difficult for the majority of the world's population ever since. The birth of capitalism also marked the origin of mass poverty as a historical phenomenon. By the middle of the 1600s, the word poverty had come into common use to describe this condition, and then during the late 18th and 19th centuries, the term became entrenched in English language discourse. In the same way, systems such as racism and patriarchy were used as tools for institutionalizing capitalism, for example by pitting working class women against working class men, or using racist language to justify colonialism. The very foundations upon which capitalism was built off of these systems of racism and patriarchy. The mainstream message that we're always being fed is that capitalism is a natural and inevitable human behaviour, but as we've seen, there's nothing natural or inevitable about any of this. Capitalism is built off of mass violence, mass impoverishment and mass exploitation, both at home and abroad. The birth of capitalism also eroded cultural expectations such as the right to land and right to shelter and the right to food, so that today, as we see throughout the West, it's very normal for us to normalize people being homeless, not having access to food or shelter at all. The rise of capitalism also changed Europe's approach to imperialism. Rather than direct, coercive forms of wealth appropriation like we saw in Latin America and Africa, they instead began to force the enclosure movement on the rest of the world. It started in Ireland in 1585 when English colonizers made their first attempt at reproducing the new system of enclosure and improvement in a foreign territory. They forcibly expropriated the land of Irish peasants, impoverishing vast numbers of people. By the early 1800s, Irish peasants had so little land for their own use that they were planting only potatoes. This dependency proved deadly when the potato blight hit in 1845, and over the next 7 years, 1 million people, more than 7% of the population, died in what became known as the Great Famine. What made this so horrifying was that the famine was completely avoidable if peasants had retained full rights to their ancestral land. Instead, at the same time as such a huge number of people were dying of starvation, about 30 to 50% of their food was being shipped over to the British. The same system was also reproduced in the Americas, and the consequences were devastating. In America, the English in the 1600s began the enclosure movement, dispossessing indigenous populations, killing thousands, whilst the warfare that ensued resulted in dozens of bloody massacres. The process of mass enclosure opened up more than 25 million acres for white settlement, clearing the way for mass tobacco and cotton plantations and intensive grain farming techniques upon which slaves were forced to work, marking the beginning of the US on a trajectory to become the Western power it is today. The colonization of India also began in the 1600s, where the Indian population was forced against their will to adopt new agricultural systems to export crops for markets in Europe. Not only did Europeans want to extract labor and resources, but also turn India into consumers of Europe's manufacturing goods, placing them into a dependent relationship with the West. India, once self-sufficient and famous for its exports, was remade into what is now known as the greatest captive market in world history. Aside from the human cost of this brutally violent dispossession and colonization and forcing them into the labour market, 10 to 30 million Indians died from avoidable droughts, whilst India had more than enough food to feed the population because the food was shipped to Europe. At the time, wealthy Europeans insisted that this was just a natural disaster, but this was a complete and utter lie. These were the predictable consequences of forcing an economic model onto a nation that would destroy their basic human food security, whilst at the same time sacrificing tens of millions of people so that a few people could profit. These were the direct results of India's incorporation into the capitalist world system. As for China, Britain began to sell opium, grown in colonial India, on China's black market. China clamped down on this and Britain retaliated in an invasion. China lost these so-called opium wars in the early 1800s, and the treaties gave Europeans permission to sell their manufactured goods on China's markets while protecting their own markets against Chinese competitors, and also gave Europe huge trade privileges. The consequences for China were disastrous. China's share of the world economy went from 35% before the Opium Wars to an all-time low of 7% afterwards. China's loss of control over its grain markets led in part to the famines that China suffered during the same droughts that hit India. And as in India, 30 million people in China perished needlessly of starvation during the late 19th century after having been integrated into this capitalist world system. In the late 19th century, Europeans began once again to colonize Africa. They forced Africans off their land in a process that mimicked the enclosure movement in England. With no means of survival, Africans had no choice but to engage in wage work to survive. Africa has an abundance of natural resources, but the vast majority of Africans have been excluded from this abundance, with many areas kept in a state of poverty. By 1914, European control had extended over 90% of the African continent. The Europeans basically implemented a world system where the colonized countries were an open source of raw materials for Europeans to extract, whilst colonized countries were dependent on importing expensive Western goods. The Global South lost vast amounts of money because the imported finished goods would be far more expensive than the exported goods that they would sell. This whole arrangement became a major driver of global inequality. A lot of evidence suggests that India and China were ahead of Europe in terms of capita income as late as the 1800s. But by the end of the colonial period, the periphery was losing $22 billion each year as a result of unequal exchange, which is equivalent to more than $161 billion today. Today, European apologists defend colonization in India and intervention in China on the basis that it brought development to these regions. Many people argue that no matter how painful this process was, it was a necessary transition to a much more productive society today. But the evidence that we have suggests that the opposite was the case, that it was actually colonization which forced the capitalist system onto these regions, which is responsible for the great divide that we have today. In 1820, at the dawn of the second wave of imperialism, the income gap between the richest and the poorest country was just 3 to 1. By the end of colonialism, in the middle of the 19th century, the gap had risen to 35 to 1. At the end of this period, Europe had somewhere between a third and a half of the domestic capital of Africa and Asia. Europe didn't develop the colonies developed Europe. The Great Global Divide has remained ever since, with the exception of China, which is an exception that I'm going to go into a little more in next week's video. But as a whole, this Great Global Divide has continued ever since, and the inequality between countries is only getting worse. Poverty is not a natural phenomenon. It was created through robbing global wealth, exploitation of millions of people, the killing of masses of indigenous populations, the destruction of half of the Earth's infrastructure, colonial violence, and the social cost that simply cannot be explained in numbers. It is the cost associated with the ravaging and utilization of the Earth's finite resources. So the evidence is very clear. The plunder and exploitation of the global south led directly to the enrichment of the West. And this enrichment, which makes up tens of trillions of dollars, has been claimed by a relatively small sector of Western capitalists and ruling classes. It's also really important to point out that all of this is an inevitable consequence of a capitalist system. Capitalism and colonialism are inseparable. In order for a capitalist system to survive, it needs commodities to be constantly imported and exported to satisfy the need for economic growth. In order to satisfy this need, it is in constant search for new markets, and as time goes on and domestic resources become scarce, the need to dominate unoccupied land and uncooperative people becomes a necessity. So a lot of people argue that whilst colonization had an impact on creating the Great Global Divide, that since colonization ended in the 20th century, the West can't be held responsible anymore. But independence was in name only. The end of formal slavery didn't end the system of economic control and exploitation, and the system of unequal exchange and economic power remained pretty much the same as they were before. Even though independence was granted, we are not post-colonial in any meaningful sense. How and why did Western powers do this? Well, after independence, many people saw the system for what it was and wanted to free themselves from the dependence on Western powers. So throughout the 1950s and 1970s, they began developmentalism projects which drastically improved economies, human welfare, equality, and severed the ties with colonial bullies. Incomes were growing, poverty rates reducing, and the divide between rich and poor countries began to close for the first time in history. However, all of these things undermined the profits of Western powers. It meant that they no longer had access to the same labour and resources and geopolitical interests that they had previously. Rather than being pleased for the fact that the living standards in the global south was getting better, surprise, surprise, they saw it as a threat to their profit margins and power. So they began to demonize these policies in the Western media as communist in order to build support at home for them to be able to implement policies abroad without any pushback. Once they were able to garner this support, they intervened to overthrow dozens of democratically elected leaders across the South in places such as El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Chile, Iran, replacing them with dictators friendly to Western economic interests. These new dictators were then propped up as much as possible by Western powers. To give just one example, in Chile, Salvador Allende was lifted to power on his promise of a fairer society, better wages, public education, healthcare, housing, and fairer rents. And his government delivered, and it worked. Wages rose, poverty rates declined, school enrollment reached a record high.
Se proponía el estrangulamiento económico, el sabotaje diplomático, el desorden social, crear el pánico en la población, para que al ser sobrepasado el gobierno, las Fuerzas Armadas fueran impulsadas a quebrar el régimen democrático e imponer una dictadura.
But of course, the US didn't like this, and in 1973, US bombers pounded the presidential palace with mortars and missiles, and Allende was killed. Augusto Pinochet was raised to power, reigning with terror, and 3,200 people disappeared or were executed. 200,000 people fled the country as political refugees, and 80 to 100,000 people who supported Allende's ideas were arrested and imprisoned. The US also supported right-wing dictators at various times in Bolivia, Ecuador, Haiti, Honduras, Venezuela, Panama. This isn't to romanticize all of these developmental projects because they weren't without their problems, but it's really interesting and shocking to think about where these states might be today if they had been allowed to continue their pro-poor projects in peace without Western intervention. It's very possible that they would have been able to eradicate poverty altogether and shed their third world status, but sadly they were prevented from taking this path. These undemocratic coups have come to be seen as crimes against humanity, yet it's disturbing to see how today the same exact anti-communist rhetoric is used literally right this second to justify a coup and intervention in Venezuela to restore democracy when Venezuela just so happens to have the largest oil reserve in the world. Everywhere in the West, in the mainstream narrative, we hear this argument that the global South was just too primitive to be able to develop properly, or the fact that they're overpopulated. If only they were able to produce less children, the problem would be solved. But the truth is that all of these arguments are a lie. Ever since the end of colonization, the global South has actively been prevented from lifting themselves out of poverty, and it continues to be prevented from doing this today. And it's not the fact that there's too little resources for everyone. There's actually more than enough for everyone in the world. It's the fact that the global South is locked in a system of unequal exchange due to this world capitalist system. And I'm going to go into much more in detail in part 2, the ways in which this system of economic domination is maintained today through Western powers. But I want to make clear that the solution isn't simply to reduce the influence of Western powers or to get rid of a few bad apples or make reparations for past harms, although I think these things are very important. The thing that I've kept coming back to is the fact that this exploitation, poverty, inequality, colonization is an inevitable consequence of this capitalist system. No matter who is in power and what reforms are put in place, poverty and inequality are maintained through this economic system. In the feudal system, the aristocratic class maintained their dominant positions through political, military, and legal advantages. There was little incentive to increase productivity of workers or wealth accumulation. However, under a capitalist system, capitalists had no choice. This is because capitalism is an economic system where the maximization of private profit lies at its core. In other words, owners must get people to work for significantly less than their work is actually worth to make a profit. People who are in favor of capitalism argue that poverty and inequality are not inevitable byproducts of this capitalist system because the owners can choose to act in just and socially equitable ways. However, competition forces even the most socially just and equitable capitalists to act in inherently exploitative and unjust ways, because if they don't, another firm will, and they'll be pushed out of the market and go bankrupt and won't be able to continue their practices at all. To remain competitive and not be pushed out of the market, they have to continuously push down the prices of the commodities that they're selling. But in order to be able to push down the prices of commodities, they also necessarily have to put a downward pressure on wages in order to continue making a profit. So capitalists are forced to continuously cut costs and use cheaper and cheaper labor, which generally means the most inhumane ones, where workers are paid the least amount of money and made to work in the worst types of conditions. In a capitalist system, profit is organized around short-term horizons. There's no consideration for the well-being of people or the planet. This has led to a global system where colonized countries are essentially produced as global sweatshops for the West, kept in an underclass state, making just a few dollars a day. If workers start to organize and demand better conditions, corporations can simply move their businesses elsewhere to a country that will allow them to continue their practices at even lower prices. So the majority of poor and working people across the globe have no choice because they'd be endangering their jobs and therefore their lives and the lives of their families. And none of these disturbing scandals of the conditions workers are kept under lead to any meaningful change because corporations use subcontractors so they can say that they're not directly involved, they had no idea, and it allows them to get away with extreme forms of exploitation and suffering. And this isn't just the case in colonized countries. Even in so-called rich countries, the majority of people exist on a low wage or no wage at all, barely getting by week. Pressure to put a downward pressure on costs also incentivizes capitalists to invest in labour-saving technology to gain competitive advantage. Some experts estimate that about 50% of jobs will be automated by 2050, leaving the rest of us in a state of precarity and unemployment and poverty. And even worse, capitalism needs a significant amount of us to be living in a state of unemployment and poverty. The so-called reserve army of labour is kept barely alive by social services so that wages can decrease even further because workers compete for jobs in order to survive. This system inherently creates wealth for a few at the expense of the majority, and it's a system where capitalists have all the power whilst labour is increasingly disenfranchised. And aside from the labour element of this, in order to remain competitive, capitalists have to continue to pillage and plunder across the globe. Western powers create global conflicts and wars to gain access to cheap labour, markets, geopolitical influence and natural resources, the consequences of which create vast levels of poverty and inequality. It's estimated that in coming decades, 2/3 of humanity will not have the ecological space for survival, neither land nor water nor biodiversity, because all of that is being transformed into private property and commodity. The endless pursuit of growth and profit is also inherently unsustainable because it requires the continuous extraction of raw materials, relying on fossil fuel energy and the mass disposal of waste, and unsustainable conflicts contributing to climate change on a mass scale. As we know, the poorest across the globe are going to shoulder the worst effects of climate change, propelling them into yet more poverty, inequality and suffering as they're forced to deal with the ramifications of climate disasters. Competition doesn't just exist within nations, it also exists between nations, driving a larger and larger formation of poor and unemployed workers from which corporations can pick and choose. The result is not lifting people out of poverty, it's forcibly maintaining them in a state of slavery, too poor to escape from this exploitation. It's also important to note that things like water, food, clothes, shelter in this capitalist system are not produced in order for people to use them, they're produced to make a profit. If a profit can't be made, this food and water and clothing will not be redistributed but destroyed. If capital and income were redistributed, capitalism would no longer exist, and whilst I'm all for reform as much as possible, no matter how much effort is put into peace building and poverty alleviation and inequality reduction within this system, none of this will ever be enough because this system inherently depends on the maintenance and perpetuation of poverty and inequality and exploitation. We need to completely build a new system out of the ashes of the old if we are to have any hope of addressing the multiple disasters that are rooted in this economic system. And it's not even radical leftists that are making these points. Even mainstream media articles are waking up to this reality and talking about the crisis of capitalism. I think the more we look at all of this, the more we can see that Karl Marx was right when he said, "Other people's money is not justifiably theirs to begin with. Instead, things like personal wealth, land and power are accumulated in only one fundamental way, through the murdering, maiming, coercing, stealing, robbing or exploiting of others." Poverty and inequality doesn't just exist, it is created. It is an inevitable part of the capitalist system. So why does poverty exist in a world of plenty? Because of hundreds of years of colonial rule in which massive amounts of wealth and land were recuperated. And wealth was built off of the back of stolen resources, subsistence economies were destroyed, and millions of people were displaced and coerced into the labour market, pushing inequality up and wages down. And colonizers destroyed domestic industries so that colonized countries would be dependent on Western imports. The mainstream message always tells us that poverty and inequality was a natural phenomenon, as if it has always just existed, but the evidence shows us that the opposite was true. Our whole lives we are told in the West that we are the heroes, we are the democratic good guys. But this kind of message exists to maintain a veil over our eyes so that we just accept the status quo. It exists in order to make us think that the way to create change is to tinker at the knobs of this deeply flawed system. This message exists as a convenient alibi to allow us in the West to disavow responsibility for all the misery and destruction that we have caused in the past, and to enable us to continue these practices today. It's so difficult for me to convey in this video and even be able to comprehend myself the extent of suffering that all this stuff represents that I've talked about today. So often information and statistics doesn't convey the real human and environmental impact, but these are people with dreams and aspirations, with communities and families that have been maimed, exploited, and killed. In part 2, which I'm going to upload next week, I'm going to talk about the ways in which poverty and inequality are maintained through trade agreements and through resource extraction and debts in the 21st century. I also made a video about how capitalism causes climate change, and a video about how my problematic volunteerism experience, where I felt like a hero, but was actually just another form of colonization on my part. If you're interested, I'll link them both in the description box below. To make this video as concise as possible, I've had to simplify a lot of this information, so I'm definitely going to link below a lot more resources for anyone who's interested in reading up more and more about this stuff. But I just want to say thank you so much for listening to me and getting right to the end of this video, and I would really appreciate if you could consider becoming a Patreon, because making this video, doing all of this research takes so much time. And I'd really appreciate the support to enable me to make videos more frequently and also to improve the equipment that I'm using. I also want to say a huge shout out to James Finley for editing this video. He has a YouTube channel that I'll link in the description box below that everyone should go and check out.